Welcome to the RE Podcast, the first dedicated RE podcast for students and teachers.
Season 4, Episode 7, the one about religion and horror movies. My name is Louisa Jane Smith, and this is the RE Podcast, the podcast for those of you who think RE is boring, which it is, and I'll prove it to you. This week, I am going to be talking to John W Morehead about the relationship between religion and horror in a special Halloween episode of the RE Podcast. He has written so many books on it. For example, Theology and Horror, Josh Whedon and Religion, the Undead and Theology. He might actually be the world's greatest expert on this topic. So I am so excited to invite him to the RE Podcast today. Welcome, John.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
John, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, well, first, I appreciate the praise, but I would not consider myself the world's greatest expert on this. I try and have my own contribution, but over the years, I have interacted with a lot of great thinkers. This is an area that has, when I first started looking at it about 20 years ago, there wasn't much out there by way of academic analysis. But it really has changed, and it's really an up-and-coming kind of area of scholarly study, and I'm privileged to be a part of it and have my own contribution. Basically, I was going to seminary at the time, taking my degree in intercultural studies, my graduate degree, and I have always been interested in horror and Halloween and things like that growing up. But when I was taking courses in seminary, I took one on paganism, looking at new religious movements. And I was struck when the instructor said that fantasy is of great interest as a literary and motion picture form for pagans. And I thought maybe there's something to this intersection between religion and other genres, whether it's horror, science fiction, or fantasy. And I would occasionally blog my thoughts on that on a blog I had when I was a student. And then I started posting more and more, and I thought, I wonder if I have enough in me to create a separate blog devoted just to that. And I created something called Theophantastique, God of the Fantastic. And I started just interacting with the academics and writing my thoughts on it. And then I would reach out to authors and say, would you be willing to come on and talk about it and do an interview? And they were all too willing to talk about their work and to develop something of a reputation. And I was asked to write endorsement blurbs and chapters to contribute to things. And I was able to edit and co-edit some volumes on the topic. I was even bold enough to reach out to a film director, Scott Derrickson, who's done some horror work. And as a Christian, he was intrigued and came on the program. So again, I'm not the world's foremost authority on this subject matter, but I work with a lot of smart people who've been analyzing this stuff and trying to figure it out along with myself.
So let's start right from the very beginning. Can you tell me what was the first horror film that really referenced religion?
Yeah, I had to go back and do my homework on this. First, I think it's important to keep in mind that some of the earliest films that were ever produced had to do with horror and science fiction. In fact, the earliest horror film that was done was from 1896, and it has two titles it goes by, The Haunted Castle and also The House of the Devil, which is interesting. It doesn't really include religion per se. It does have a satanic figure in it, but that obviously is influenced by Christianity. And of course, Thomas Edison's famous Frankenstein film from 1910. But as far as I'm able to tell, I went back and looked. Nosferatu from 1922 is a fascinating little film that includes elements of what's called Western esotericism, or in popular parlance, we call it the occult. There's a scene where someone holds up a letter with occultic, esoteric script on it. In the movie posters, it's produced by Prana Film, and Prana is a term that comes from both Hinduism and the Western esoteric tradition. So the producers of that film were intrigued by the Western esoteric tradition and decided to incorporate, where they could, elements of their religious experience within the film. So I think it's one of the earliest incorporations of religion within a film.
And what about some films maybe that we've heard of? What are the sort of classic examples of horror films that have referenced religion sort of throughout the sort of last 100 years or so?
Oh, I mean, folks, even if you haven't seen it, you've heard of The Exorcist.
Yeah.
Right? Classic possession film. In fact, that really helped launch the whole demonic possession series of horror films that's considered a classic in the field. A lot of others have tried to rise to that level and really haven't gotten there. It also helped launch the satanic film genre. So while The Exorcist came at the subject matter of religion and horror and possession and Satan from a Catholic perspective, There was also the Protestant perspective, which kind of took off after The Exorcist through the Omen films. The idea that there was this Antichrist and it's raised as a child close to American government and is destined to take over the world. So there are those kinds of films out there. And then you'll find films that don't have religion that's overt, but it kind of hovers in the background. It's there and you just never know when it's going to surface. One of my favorites is The Mist, based upon a story by Stephen King, where a group of people are trapped in this supermarket and a mist literally encompasses everything. And it turns out that it's the result of the government tinkering around and releasing ultra-dimensional forces, monsters that come out. And one of the interesting things for me about that film is not just the paranoia that results from this group that's trapped. That's a common feature in many horror films. But the fact that they include a very religious fundamentalist character in there, and she interprets what's going on outside of that and their predicament through a fundamentalist Christian lens. And when things start to get bad, she develops a following. And it soon becomes us versus them, and they end up having to kill her and escape and try and make their way. And it's a fascinating little commentary on religious fanaticism and religion gone awry. So you'll find a number of horror films that deal with religion either overtly, they incorporate it because they're dealing with certain ideas and tropes that have become associated with it, like the cross and the crucifix in vampire films, or some that merely pick up on it because it's a part of the air that we breathe, and they want to play with it, experiment with it, and maybe have some commentary to say about it.
I mean, there's so many things I want to pick up on there. I want to talk about sort of monsters and the concept of monsters within the Bible, and then sort of repeating that into horror movies. I want to talk about why there's this link between horror and religion. But I do just have to mention my good friend Giles Goff, who does a podcast called God in Film, and he was desperate to come and be part of this and wasn't able to. But he did ask me to ask you about two films. One was St. Maud and one was Satanic Panic. Have you seen either of those? What are your thoughts?
No, I haven't seen the first one. I haven't even heard of it. The second one, I'm familiar with the phenomenon upon which it is based, but I haven't seen the film itself. Of course, Satanic Panics, I don't know if they took place across the pond, but here in America, in the 1980s and in the early 1990s, there was this phenomenon. And I think in part it was fueled by what we see in horror films. It's amazing the reach and influence that these kinds of things can have. But there was this fear that there were secret underground satanic groups that kidnap children, impregnate women to have children that they can offer as sacrifice. None of this has ever been demonstrated. The FBI did an investigation of this. Kenneth Lanning released a special FBI report. There's no evidence to support Satanic Panic whatsoever. Nevertheless, these claims have been made, lives have been destroyed. 3 young men went to prison and were almost executed, known as the West Memphis Three, because some boys were out biking and their bodies were later found and there was some mutilation involved. And because these were outcast teens, the assumption was they were involved in the occult and it was Satanist, and therefore they were eventually released after being in prison, I think, for some 20 years or something like that. So these things have real life impact. I haven't seen the film, but if it has anything to do with Satanic Panic and the real phenomenon of the world, I think it's something that we're taking a look at.
And do you think that, therefore, horror movies can lead to moral panic or have led to moral panic?
I don't know if I would frame it as lead to moral panic. I think they can serve as a backdrop and maybe inform it. There are many horror films that deal with paganism, satanic cults, witches, all this kind of thing. I also, in addition to my work in pop culture, work with new religious movements. And I've studied and I dialogue with pagans and Wiccans and Satanists. And none of what they do and believe has anything to do with what we see in horror films. It's really the horror films that informs this pop culture common reservoir of what we think is real. And then there's a blurred line between reality and fantasy. And so many of the things that might be believed in a satanic panic really comes more from horror films and our folkloric kinds of assumptions rather than reality.
Because I think that's the thing. I think that witchcraft and paganism get quite a bad rap, I think, in the film industry. And it's seen as this very black and white thing that, you know, there is good and there is evil. And sort of paganism and witchcraft seems to be sort of shoehorned into the sort of evil side, when actually the reality is that they're sort of nature-loving and good people who have very high moral standards and a real sense of care and love for humanity.
Yeah, and I think part of that comes from the history of Christianity and its oppression of alleged witches in places like Salem, Massachusetts, and the witch hunts. We have witch hunts going on today in Africa. where Christians are literally putting people to death that they believe are impacted and possessed and victims of witchcraft. So it's a problem that continues in the present day.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting and fascinating thing. And I want to come back to something that you said in a minute. But first of all, can we just think about how this connection between religion and horror came about?
I think there's a very natural connection. What's interesting to me is many conservative Christians, sometimes I have been critiqued. I come from a Christian background, perhaps a bit more open, less conservative Christian background than some of my critics, but I have received criticism. Why are you into horror? Why all this violence and blood and guts and things like that? I do think that those kinds of criticisms are misguided because it really ends up coming from a sanitized view of the Bible and the Christian faith. There are, I think, horrific elements in the Bible. There's violence and things like that. There are monstrous figures. And it's not just the Christian tradition. There have been studies of monsters and the horrific that are connected to all religious traditions. So there's always been this very natural connection between gods and monsters. In fact, I'm one of the co-editors of an online peer-reviewed journal called the Journal of Gods and Monsters. And that particular line comes from a line in the Bride of Frankenstein film, where Dr. Pretorius holds up his glass and he's giving a cheer with Dr. Frankenstein. He says, "To a new world of gods and monsters." So there was a recognition in that film that there's been this historically intimate connection between gods and monsters. You see it in the Christian tradition in the Old Testament, where there's a connection between God and certain chaos monsters. God himself can, and this may sound blasphemous to conservative religious listeners, but God himself can at times be construed as acting in monstrous fashion, as in genocides and floods which kill all human and animal life, and the story of Noah that we tell in Sunday school, and greatly sanitized. So there's been this long connection. So what we're trying to do with these academic studies and popular studies is help people see this connection and then ask ourselves the question, what does this tell us about the human condition, about our fascination with the monstrous, and how religion and the monstrous and horror have this long historical connection?
In the Injil Sharif, Hazrat Isa al-Masih taught, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see Allah." Many religious people are obsessed with outward purity, but Allah Ta'ala is concerned about the purity of our hearts. According to this ayat, we can only draw close to the Almighty if our hearts are pure. Come learn how Allah Ta'ala wants to purify your heart on the Injil for Muslims podcast.
I mean, it was interesting. So I was going to ask you if you saw sort of any conflict between your religious faith and horror. And actually, you've quite articulately said no, because the Bible is full of horror stories and it's got monsters in it. So some of the most famous monsters in history are from the Bible. Could you just talk about Satan or Leviathan or, some of those sort of classic biblical monsters?
Yeah, let me just say really quickly that I haven't always had this view. I was involved in a very conservative Christian setting early on in my religious life, and I kind of set the horror stuff to the side because I thought that's what you have to do. But then after rethinking it and revisiting it years later, I didn't see any real good reasons to do that, but I still get the critique. And part of that process of coming to a new conclusion was looking at the biblical material itself. If you want to critique me from a perspective of the Christian tradition, you really have to do it because I've actually dove deeper into the tradition itself. It's not because I'm neglecting the tradition. And what I found, and other scholars have pointed out, is you have biblical monsters like Leviathan and Behemoth in the Old Testament. And these mythic, monstrous figures that we find parallels with in the ancient Near East and other cultures. And they're basically chaos monsters. So they come in, they create chaos. The divine warrior, or God in the case of the biblical tradition, comes in and overcomes the chaos monster and restores order. But many times that's not a permanent condition. Chaos can always come up again, and then God has to intervene and restore order once more. So we have these Old Testament mythic monsters moving into the New Testament. Of course, the greatest monstrous figure, the adversary or Satan that possesses individuals. And of course, Satan is a figure that continues to develop beyond the New Testament period in Christian history and become even larger. So the Bible itself is filled with monsters, which is in keeping with its ancient Near Eastern setting. What it does is it borrows and reshapes the material in other cultures for its own purposes, and that's quite natural, and that's to be expected. So I am not surprised in visiting the material more deeply to find this close connection between gods and monsters in the biblical material.
And how do you think these biblical monsters have influenced horror?
Sometimes they've done it directly and sometimes indirectly. In terms of directly, you'll find we've already talked about The Exorcist, this idea of Satan and demonic possession. Again, whether or not these horror films really reflect what the biblical tradition is presenting is another question, but the assumption is that that's what's going on. And so you'll find a number of films featuring Satan, featuring demonic possession, featuring exorcism. That's become a very popular thing. And then you have lots of variations within that. Some more recent demon possession and exorcism films have featured not just the Catholic perspective, not just a generic Protestant one, but also Pentecostal perspectives on what exorcism is all about. So it's influencing directly. They're taking what stereotypes, if you will, what they think the biblical tradition's all about, but sometimes it kind of informs in the backdrop. I wrote this really brief essay for a book on slasher films several years ago where I argued that the figure of Michael Myers from the Halloween films, in the very first film, we tend to think of him as he's a slasher like Freddy or any of the other slashers that have arisen. He has become that, but originally he wasn't that. He was called the Shape, and he really was a chaos monster. You really can't kill him. He's always there. He comes in and creates chaos and disorder. And then he's subdued for a while, but can always rise again. And my argument was that perhaps we can understand him as being informed in some way by the Judeo-Christian tradition with this idea of chaos monsters that arise and need to be subdued. And so that would be an example of kind of how the Christian tradition, because it's so infused into the Western mindset, that even though we are moving towards secularism and pluralism at the same time, it's still in the DNA. And so it's naturally going to surface in our myths, in our entertainment, in our thought forms, and in horror films.
Mm. And I think I don't want to reduce anything, and this might be too reductive, but just this idea of good and evil.
Oh, yes.
It's been with us throughout the whole of human history, that actually it's come from religion and it's informed, every bit of literature and every film and every creative outlet on that basic level is good versus evil.
Oh, yes. There are various views of good and evil. There are different views on what is the foundation for good and evil. I think in the West, it tends to be grounded in the assumptions of a Christian worldview. We're starting to see some pushback now with the move towards secularism that maybe it should be grounded in the Enlightenment, so there's a healthy debate. I fall back on the idea that you really can't ground human rights without reference to some kind of transcendent source, but there's a debate out there. Nevertheless, I think much of what we see in horror films falls back on this idea of good and evil that really has a religious basis to it. And it's interesting to see the development. In the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, you see films where you've got good and evil. They're clearly defined. Good always trumps evil, and usually with divine aid. But then with the rise of the counterculture in the late 1960s, that begins to change. We're not quite sure who's good and evil. Evil moves from the outside and the other into the self. I think Hitchcock's Psycho really helped do that in terms of horror films, where it's not just the monstrous other. It can be the guy living next door who turns out to dress like his mother and kill people. So the location of the monstrous other moves to the self. The family can be infected. We don't trust institutions anymore, so we really don't know how to judge good versus evil. In fact, those things that we think are good, they turn out to be evil. And so horror changes as we change. And so what you start seeing in the 1960s and 1970s is a much darker, ambiguous way of treating the question of good and evil. So you're quite correct that good and evil is a major element where religion and horror come together.
And for me, probably the greatest example of horror in the Bible is the book of Revelation, where this idea of good and evil really comes to a head. In what way has Revelation, do you think, influenced horror?
Well, anybody who has picked up the book of Revelation can be forgiven for reading it as a piece of horror. I mean, first of all, it's a very symbolic book. I think many times we read it far too literally. We tend to read it in terms of it's pointing to the future. I think there are good arguments for saying it spoke to the first century community as apocalyptic literature to their concerns that they were experiencing politically, religiously as an oppressed religious minority. within the empire, but nevertheless, we look at it as a piece of something that's referring to the future and predicting all kinds of awful things. You've got the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, death and hell and famine and all this. You've got beasts rising up out of the abyss. You've got the great dragon that's in there and all of this. And so these ideas, these apocalyptic ideas, have, again, infiltrated our consciousness. And so we see it played out in any number of, not just horror films, but sometimes there's also a kind of a combination genre, action horror films, if you will. So there's an interesting little film called Legion, where I think it is Michael the Archangel decides that he just doesn't think God's being just. And so he cuts off his wings and decides to go to earth and fight on behalf of human beings. And the hordes of heaven come to try and execute God's judgment. Well, that's all loosely based, if you will, or connected to these concerns of apocalypse in the book of Revelation. The Omen films touch on this idea where you have this figure of the Antichrist. Interestingly, the Antichrist is not in the book of Revelation. This figure only shows up in the epistles of John. But again, what we see in the biblical material may not necessarily be accurately reflected in the material in horror films. In fact, in The Omen, in the 1970s version, there's a quote, and if you're just listening, not watching, I'm using air quotes here, from the book of Revelations. It's not Revelations, it's Revelation singular. It always drives me crazy when they do that. And the quote that they have is made up by the screenwriter. It's found nowhere in the book of Revelation at all, but many people probably watched it and said, oh yeah, that's in the book of Revelation. So as we look at this phenomenon of religion and horror films, we need to be able to, when it's appropriate, to tease out religious studies and biblical studies and what that might have to tell us, and what pop culture studies and horror studies and the monstrous might tell us as those two things come together.
Mm. And obviously, probably the epitome of horror imagery within the Bible is the descriptions of hell. And that's probably informed horror movies, for a long time. Am I right?
Yeah, I think that's correct, for better or worse. I wouldn't necessarily assume that the Bible is talking about the fiery, eternal conscious torment that we assume again when we see it reflected in horror films. There is a lively debate among scholars as to what that means. There are various views. What's interesting in the biblical tradition, in the Bible as a whole, you find very little discussion of the afterlife. There's more concern about living with God at the center in the here and now. So in the Old Testament, you have this vague concept of Sheol, where the dead go. In the New Testament, you have Abraham's bosom and resurrection and this kind of thing. The references to hellfire are very few, and they may actually not refer to some kind of metaphysical location that one goes to post-mortem. It may actually refer, maybe Jesus' language as a prophetic warning to the destruction that's going to come upon Jerusalem with the upcoming Jewish wars where Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70. And he's using hyperbolic language. But nevertheless, over time, the church has come to develop this idea of metaphysical place that one goes to, one's spirit goes to after death. And it's a horrific thing. And it has informed many horror films, either people going there or the fear of going there. One film, Drag Me to Hell, by Sam Raimi, is very good. It's this young lady who comes under a curse by an old gypsy woman, and she is destined to go to hell. And spoiler alert, she thinks she's taken care of the curse and gotten rid of it and passed it on to somebody else, only in the final scene to have it come back. And she literally is pulled under the earth to a literal physical hell. And so that's just one example of the ways in which this concept has impacted horror. I would also say that this is a horrific concept, whether it's in horror films or not. And I really think it's a concept that Christians might want to rethink. We almost seem gleeful about the possibility of people who disagree with us about religious ideas will spend eternity in a conscious place of eternal torment, and God is all too happy to send people there. So it's a horrific idea whether it surfaces in horror films or not.
I think it's something that's come up before in a previous episode with a guy called Steve Chalk, who was saying that a God of love would not send people to an eternal place of suffering. It's just not consistent. And actually, if you see the language in the Bible in its context, and if it's understanding of the sort of Judeo beliefs at the time, that it probably isn't a metaphysical place of eternal suffering that actually talks about, it's a place on earth. It's an experience you can have of earth of living without God, and living without forgiveness for things that you've done wrong actually is your own sort of hell. So what do you think are the similar themes or questions that are dealt with in both horror and religion?
I think religion and horror are grappling with several common themes. sometimes, is there a God? Is there anything transcendent beyond this that we can root our lives in? Are we just mortal beings? Is there life beyond this? And if there is it someplace worth going to? I mean, there is the possibility that there's immortality, but it's even worse than what we experience here. The questions of good and evil, you and I have already talked about. The weakness of our flesh. We are, at the end of the day, fleshly beings. And we fight constantly that reality that looks us back in the mirror every day with makeup and diets and all kinds of things. But at the end of the day, I know this now that I'm in my late 50s. I am slowly decaying, whether I want to admit it or not. Horror deals with that, especially through the subgenre of body horror. I think we are the only animal that is aware of this process and fights it so much. And so you'll see that reflected in horror films. So the body dying in bad ways, there are all kinds of common elements, which is why I find it so difficult that people resist the idea that there is this overlap between religion and horror. I really think they developed historically along similar lines. I think human beings, as we evolved, religion evolved with us. We've always been storytelling creatures as we sat around campfires. And I think telling stories about what scared us, about what scared our tribe, in connection with our religious beliefs, is an ancient part of what it means to be human.
And do you think that's maybe the key to why people love horror so much? Or do you think there's other reasons why we love it?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. There's some interesting studies that are going on right now. I know the Templeton Foundation has a grant out for some research on what horror can tell us about religion, which I'm fascinated by the upcoming results. Another scholar outside of the U.S. is doing some research on why we pursue fear and horror as entertainment. If you stop and think about that, right? We don't normally seek out things that scare us to death, but around Halloween and with horror films, we do. So there's some kind of psychological benefit there. Otherwise, we wouldn't do it. Keep away from it. There are other things that we're frightened of that we don't try to experience. We try and stay away from it. Nevertheless, we have this whole huge entertainment industry devoted to what scares us. So there's something meaningful here psychologically, and it's scratching us where we're itching psychologically.
I mean, I don't want to get too deep into sort of Jungian psychology, but actually it could be that we are, trying to connect with something in order to become a full and whole person, and that good and evil and yin and yang is in all of us, and we need to connect with those. Or it could be just a way of stopping it from having power over us, is to manifest it in a form of entertainment. So, I mean, it's a fascinating line of a sort of thought and investigation. Do you think, and this is an incredibly difficult question, but do you think there would be horror if there wasn't any religion?
It's always difficult to speculate about unknown. I think there would be horror. I think it would take a different shape if there were no religion, because obviously our entertainment, our art is an expression and extension of what we are. Our hopes, our fears, and that kind of a thing. And so it's quite natural for religious hopes and fears to be found and expressed in the art that we produced, including horror films. So if it wasn't there, it would still be there. You'd still have it. It would just take different elements. And if you want to know what it would look like, just look at those horror films and television and novels that carry on without reference to any religious element or even critique it. I mean, one of the things I'm fascinated with is the work of Guillermo del Toro, the great Mexican filmmaker.
You've got a book on this, haven't you?
Yeah. He does these dark fantasies. They aren't horror per se. He wouldn't call them horror. He calls them dark fantasy. But what I find fascinating is he weaves in his own experience. He was raised by a stern Catholic grandmother. He saw some horrific things in Mexico growing up, and this caused him to reject his Catholicism. And he really views monstrosity as his form of spirituality. So going back to your Jungian idea, I really think there's something there that rather than religious people keeping monsters at arm's length, I really think they can serve a pedagogical function for us. They can help teach us things about ourselves and even about our religious traditions.
And I have to say, if you haven't seen Pan's Labyrinth or The Shape of Water, if you're listening to us today, recommend both of those films by Guillermo del Toro. Absolutely fascinating and a really interesting twist on the horror genre. I do have to ask you, and I think this is going to be probably the toughest question yet. If you could pick your favourite horror movie, what would it be?
Boy, that is a tough one because there's so many good ones. I think one that really impacted me is probably my favorite because it had a strong impact on me as a young person and continued to do so upon subsequent reviewings, and was a cultural and historical milestone, and that's George Romero's Night of the Living Dead. There's just something about that. The way I watched it in the 1970s was on television, scared to death, watching my local TV horror host. I would watch it in segments and then turn off the TV and turn it on again once I got my nerve up. Eventually talked my younger brother into coming in and watching it with me, acting like I was the brave one. And it may sound silly now. We're so used to The Walking Dead and zombies everywhere and blood and gore, but this was groundbreaking. Transforming zombies from Haiti that were basically human beings under mind control and drug control into flesh-eating cannibals come back from the dead. That was a groundbreaking transformation. It was in black and white. You have this small group of people beset by zombies from the outside that turn on each other. They can't even get along together. You have the racial component with an African-American lead, even into the ending credits where this African-American character has survived where nobody else has, and he's looking out the window and he's shot by the white mob who are coming to kill the zombies, and he is dragged out with meat hooks in this grainy closing footage and put on the same bonfire right next to the zombie we see in the opening scene. And so all of it just really comes together as a great commentary on the human condition in the late 1960s. And I think it still has valid cultural commentary on where we are today, unfortunately.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think actually it's impossible to kind of explain the influence that film has had. And if that film hadn't been made, how different our culture would be. You know, so many things that just wouldn't exist.
Right.
I think, yeah, if you haven't seen that, I definitely recommend it because I just think it's influenced so much of the genre since then, really. It was groundbreaking. And any final thoughts, John, for our listeners?
I would just encourage readers to seek out not just popular treatments of the subject of religion and horror, but there's some really good and accessible academic treatments. Authors like Brandon Graffius, my co-author, Douglas Cowan has written several volumes. Folks can reach out if they want, or they can simply Google religion and horror. They'll find all kinds of things out there. And it really will help you appreciate what's going on and the place this plays in popular culture, not just as entertainment, but something that gives us an opportunity for deeper personal and cultural reflection.
And I also think just for teachers out there, just a really interesting way of explaining religious themes and biblical themes is through movies. So, John, thank you so much for being part of the RE podcast today. This is a proper geek out for me, and it's been so wonderful talking to you and so enlightening. If people want to connect with you, what's the best way that they can do that?
They can go out to my blog, theofantastique.com, and they'll find an about page where it's got a little description, my bio, when some of my work is listed out there, and an email address. I'd be more than happy with people who have follow-up questions to hit me up and look at some of the things that I've written and links to all kinds of things. There's plenty of things there to keep them busy for quite a while.
Brilliant. And we'll put links to those in the show notes. And as always, if you want to get in touch with me about this episode or any previous episodes, then please do at the RE Podcast 1 on Twitter, at the RE Podcast on Instagram. Email me, louisajanesmith at therepodcast.co.uk or the website, www.therepodcast.co.uk. My name is Louisa Jane Smith, and this has been the RE Podcast, the podcast for those of you who think RE is boring, which it is. We just proved it. But thank you so much for letting me bore the life out of you.